On today's episode, we're speaking to an MD MBA about why he got the MBA and what lessons he's learned from working for quite a few healthcare adjacent companies. Stay tuned and learn a few lessons. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we have a special guest. He's going to be guest hosting himself on the show, covering health IT, among other things. So welcome to the show, Dr. George Mathew, who is an internal medicine doctor who's had 20 plus years of corporate experience at companies such as GE, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, Aetna, Hewlett-Packard, among a ton of others. If you check him out on LinkedIn, you'll see his resume. He's had a lot of jobs. He specializes in digital health and artificial intelligence as applied to healthcare. And he's currently the Chief Medical Officer of North America, Datalys, which is a global health IT company that provides solutions for clinical trials and care delivery. So given his varied experience in the world of business of healthcare, we're going to get his takeaways from that job experience. So Dr. George Mathew, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Dr. Brad Block, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with your MBA, right? So why did you decide to get an MBA? Because I know that's a lot of us, we think about it, some move forward with it, but what was your reasoning?
So mine will be a little bit different than most. I think for a lot of folks now, they want career options and they want to be able to fan out beyond the typical clinical practice. For me, when I was looking at this, I was looking back in the 90s when I was in med school. I had a good friend of mine that we were both looking at what if we branched out outside of clinical. He'd gotten a copy of the McKinsey Quarterly. It was like, oh, there's something else you can do with your medical degree.
Sorry, what's the McKinsey Quarterly?
McKinsey, the consulting firm, used to have a magazine that they would put out their thinking on where business trends or consulting were going every 3 months. It was a bit of a marketing, advertising type thing, but it was mostly to their clients. But it also was when they were considered one of the premier thought leaders out there in terms of shaping where business would go in all sectors, including healthcare. Yeah, I was in a 7-year program at BU at the time. So pretty tunnel vision on healthcare and being a doctor. Came from a family of doctors, figured that was all you could do with an MD. Didn't know until much later that you could do more. My friend finished a year ahead of me out of med school. We stayed pretty tight all the way through residency. And then during my last year of residency, he passed away. Ended up having to code him. And it was one of those things where it was just like, you're in your last year of your residency, you're doing CPR and it didn't work. It kind of got me thinking about what we had talked about for years, which was leaving clinical practice and really trying to make a change in the healthcare system. So that year I had started applying for business schools and I got into Duke in their health sector management program. So after that, I finished up my residency and then went into business school. So as I said, it's a little bit different for me. Around that time, that's when they started having some of the first MD MBA programs where people were kind of going through both at the same time. But for me, it was always kind of I owe it to my friend.
Wow, I'm so sorry. For those of us considering getting an MBA now, right? You were saying like the MBA was in its infancy, but now, 2024, for those of us considering it, what advice would you have?
When I was doing it, the whole idea was I was changing careers and I had no experience in business. What I've found over the last 20 plus years is that, quite honestly, you get more experience doing the business than studying about it. It's not to say that there aren't advantages to it. If you go to a top tier business school, the network and the doors that open to you are matchless. It'll accelerate your career faster than you would get there on your own most of the time. Everything you need to learn for business, basically, if you take an accounting class and a finance class and just build a business, you're going to learn more from a couple of years of that than you would out of any business school.
All right, we'll do some podcast episodes on that so that people don't even have to enroll.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now you got the MBA, and since then you've had on LinkedIn. So this is public information, right? I think there are like 30 jobs. I clicked the button, it said like 30 more. Click here, right? Why all the jobs?
So when I came out of business school in 2003, there weren't a lot of job openings, quite honestly. Like the market had crashed, right? You remember back in the early aughts, right?
Yeah.
You
That's when
jump
I
from
was
that.
finishing college and all of my friends were applying for jobs and those of us that were going into medical school. So I started medical school in 2002. We were like, I'm good. And then they were all like, I'm living in my basement.
And, like anything else in medicine, most people that go right out of college and go to a job, they don't go to their MBA right away. They start earning immediately. For me, coming out, I was looking for any type of work, and most people looked at my work experience. They're like, well, you've just done residency. You don't have any work experience. So,
Are you kidding me? That's not work experience.
well, it's
Yeah.
slower, as
Yeah.
you know.
But it's
And
not in the business of medicine, and you're not in as much of a leadership role in the mechanics of how healthcare works.
and
Yeah.
truthfully, there's a part of business that I'm even to this day working on, which is you need to sell yourself. You need to sell your potential. I have friends that started at the same time I did that went right on to like senior roles at HCA or Tenet or any of the other, at some of the insurance companies, right? Like Aetna at the time prior to the CVS acquisition or United Health, because they were able to sell that they understood the business part as well as the clinical part. I think for me, I never felt like I had the right experience. So I just said, look, I've got this experience and I'm willing to learn. And those are the roles that got offered to me, which
Yeah.
were basically trainee roles.
And so then you kind of outgrew the role, and then it was time for the next one.
You and I talked a little bit about this. Some of it was opportunistic. I had started at GE as a consultant. I was getting consulting training. I was learning operations, Lean Six Sigma, all the other stuff, and learning it from some of the best experts out there. I was also learning things like change management, which I had never seen in med school.
I've never heard of. What is change management?
So change management is this concept, like the whole process with GE and Lean Six Sigma is the idea of process improvement, right?
Okay.
Like if I do something and it takes 10 steps, what are the steps that are valuable? And if I take 5 of them out, I can still get everything done, but I can do it with 5 steps. That sounds really easy. The problem is, and Brad, you know this, when people get, especially in healthcare, get used to doing things a certain way, it's really hard to tell them to change that, even if you think that it's more efficient. It also is a little bit insulting to their experience and intelligence when somebody who doesn't know what they do comes in and tells them what to do. However, the thing about change management is this concept of, you know what? Let's assume the end user in the process knows it better than anybody. Let's get their input. Let's figure out how they would do it. And if they had all the time and all the money, all the resources in the world, how would they make it better? And then let's fix it so they can get the best experience possible. You're familiar with the concept of user experience. This is kind of proto-user experience because the idea was taking the input from folks, building out a mock-up of the process, trying it out and collecting data to see if that process, the new process, is better than the old process. And, you rinse, wash, and repeat until you get the outcome that you want.
Oh, interesting. And so where was it that you were doing this?
At GE.
At GE. Okay. You were not there for very long before you went to Goldman.
Because of a classmate of mine, I had done a summer internship at Citigroup doing biotech equity research. A classmate of mine from Duke had called me up and told me that there was an opportunity at Goldman Sachs. Look, I'm from the Midwest. Somebody says things like Goldman Sachs, you're like, oh yeah, I know them. And I was hesitating at first because I'd only been at my job for a little over a year. But, you take the opportunities that come your way sometimes. You try not to say no because you don't know if those opportunities are going to come again. That's definitely something I've been hearing more and more of. And there's a couple opportunities I feel about that now where you take the opportunities if you can afford to, because if you don't get them again later, you're always going to regret you didn't do it.
That's interesting because I did an episode a while ago with Megan Mello. She's a physician who talks a lot about physician overwhelm.
Yeah.
And her philosophy was a little different. It was, we are in our position as physicians, we always have opportunities. There are always going to be more opportunities. And if it's not the right time for you in your life, don't be like, oh, nothing like this is ever going to happen again. It will, or something similar, because if it's not the right time for you, then don't do it, because that's how you end up overwhelmed. Like I go through these cycles of like shedding my responsibilities and being like, oh, it's so nice. It's so nice not having all these responsibilities. And then they suddenly kind of creep up on you. But you're talking about something different. You're talking about like a job opportunity that's like Holy cow. Like to get Goldman on your resume is almost as good because you've name dropped a couple times Duke. You've said Duke more than once.
I mean, that was my happy place. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not thrilled about how the Final Four worked out or how we didn't get to it, but I was very frustrated in med school. I was still trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. When I went over to Duke, especially after residency, man, after 3 years of just slogging through and trying to figure out if this what was right for me, going to a place where people were actually kind of like, all right, man, so you like school a lot. I get it. Let's get you ready for the real world.
Yeah.
And I made a good number of friends there that I still keep in touch with to this day that, really kind of opened a new world for me that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
As you said before, the MBA, it's not necessarily what you learn there, but the connections you make. That was how long ago for you with the MBA?
Finished up in 03 and I started in 01. So we're talking
21 years ago, and you're still utilizing those connections.
I mean, and they're friends too, right? I have a
Well, there's that.
I'm the godfather to his younger daughter. I conducted their wedding, right? So it's like,
oh, wow,
those type of connections too.
So on top of all of this, so why don't you have ordained minister on your LinkedIn profile too?
I don't know if I'm up to date on it or not. Went online, got the certificate, went out to Reno because they wanted to get it on a mountain range, and I did the ceremony. My son had just been born, so we had brought him with us. So yeah, this had to be at least 10 years ago now. I think I was a little bit high on myself and started trying to sing something at one point, and my friend was like, wow, he's going for it. Okay. This doesn't sound like it did in the shower.
The acoustics of the mountain range were not
It
helping
just
you.
It wasn't right. My voice and no honey in my tea.
Through all of this, you've still kept your toe in the practice of medicine. You still practice medicine. I feel like there's always this feeling of the grass is greener. People are always like, oh, I'd love to use my degree to do something that other than see 30 patients a day or round on, I don't know how many patients hospitalists see a day, 15 patients a day. So, but you haven't taken that leap and completely left the practice of medicine. Why is that?
I did actually for a time. With incidents with my friend, I had left it for a while. And then I met my wife, who is a practicing doctor. And then what ended up happening after that was, after the flurry of jobs, as you described it, I was bootstrapping my own startup at one point. As you know, with any type of startup, that doesn't mean you always have income coming in right away.
Yeah.
And I'm very lucky that my wife was supportive at the time, because she could have been like, no, I'm out. This is too much.
It's not what I signed up for. Yeah.
While I was doing it, we were also trying to get pregnant. And it was one of the things that was like, okay, I need to take some responsibility. I actually went back for a retraining year because I hadn't seen a patient in a while. And the last thing you want to do is try to do something that especially is so important and not have your skills up to date.
Oh, yeah.
So went back as a chief resident with people 10 to 15 years younger than me, and, got my skills back. And, if it's any consolation to my father, who was a cardiologist for 50 years, well, the thing that struck me was that not only did I enjoy seeing patients because I'd been so long, a lot of my skills hadn't atrophied as badly as I thought, especially some of the physical diagnosis skills or auscultation or reading an EKG, stuff that I hadn't done in years. And I had all these young residents that were like, how do you remember to do all this stuff? And I didn't want to tell them, I don't know, learned it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's part of your DNA.
Or it's just the training, right? I mean,
yeah,
Brad, I'm sure with you as well, and for many of your guests, right? Training is traumatic in a lot of ways, but it shapes you. And I don't think a lot of those skills go away easily.
I tell my wife sometimes, because as you said, it shapes you. You would have gotten along much better with the man I was before residency. When we didn't meet until after residency, until after I was an attending. But she would have gotten along better with the guy I was before, because it hammered me into something a little more rigid, a little harder.
But she's your wife and she's with you now. She would have been with you both ways.
Good point. Let's talk about the advisory boards, because you are on quite a few advisory boards. And the way I see advisory boards is probably not realistic, right? Like, I think a few of us probably think, so they're going to pay me a bucket of money for me to just like give my opinion. Like, I just get to go, guys, I don't know if this is the best idea. Maybe you should put the start button on the bottom right side. And that. So first, give us a little more of a realistic picture of what it's like being on an advisory board. And then tell us how to get those jobs.
Okay. let me differentiate an advisory board from like a board of directors, because I think that's what a lot of people think of. Boardroom, everyone's dressed up very nicely, everyone looks very serious. And then, they kind of give a yay or a nay and they walk out, and that's about
Yeah.
it. That is not this. For a lot of the advisory boards that I'm on, it's typically startups, not publicly traded companies, right?
Okay.
That's a different beast in itself. And we can talk about that if you'd like, because I have friends that do that. But when you're not on one of those boards, there is not a paycheck coming every day,
Okay.
week, or month or year. Typically, the startup identifies you as somebody that has either knowledge or experience or a network or something that'll help the business grow. And they want to reward you with whatever they have valuable at the time. Some advisory boards have given a small stipend. That's fine. Others have just given equity because they're so early stage. And I'm, again, this is why you try to have a day job, so you can have those other opportunities that kind of keep it interesting, but at the same time, you can pay your bills. I will say that there's a great blog by one of the founders of Rock Health, where she talks about how she invested, I think it's, I forgot Haley's last name, but she was talking about how she's invested in a ton of companies and gotten a lot of equity in very early stage in a lot of companies. But even with that, she's probably lost more money than she's gained, because, not all of them have worked out. She's ended up being like a venture affiliate where she's identified companies and they've given her some equity. That equity never really, either it got diluted out or it never really paid off, or even if she bought the option, she had to pay taxes on it too. So it's not all rainbow and sunshines.
I guess it's like angel investing,
It is.
right? You put some money into like a ton of different companies, and then you really hope that one of them makes it. And then if that one makes it, then it might be worth it, but most of them fail.
It's true, but it's also, this is where being a strategic angel investor or board advisor for that matter becomes important, right? If there was a startup in your field, Brad, that you had an in, whether it's through a medical association or through a group network or whatnot, and they brought you on board and you were able to scale it up, that's something you can quantify and bring to not just equity, but also a dollar amount, right?
Yeah.
That's the type of, I hate to say horse trading, you end up doing, which is, if you're just giving advice, I think equity's fair. If you're going to actually bring them up to a scale where they're actually making a ton of money, you need to have a separate, 1099 conversation with them about, I think we can bring this much and it'll be worth this much, in which case you'll pay me this much.
And I think also it opens up a whole new world, right? Because if you can successfully help one of these turn into something, well, then everyone's going to be knocking at your door because they're going to want you to be part of their project.
That's right.
And then it just scales from there. So then where's this matchmaking happening? Is it like venture.com, healthcareventure.com, healthcareIT.com, like matchmaking service? I'll put in my profile and my picture and I'll swipe right.
It's a little bit of push and pull. Like for some, like I would say the earlier ones were very serendipitous. There was one company that I'm still kind of advising, but very little now, that was doing a bracelet monitor for the elderly. The founder of that company, he's exited other companies before. He happened to want the same domain name that I had for one of my old businesses. So he reached out. We started talking, and then he said, "Hey, look, I like your story. Do you mind being an advisor on the board?" He gave me like a smattering of shares. Trust me, they've diluted out a bit by now because it's been almost 8 years. But, it was my intro into like advising companies, because whatever I was able to do, I tried to make introductions or help out, because now I have a stake in it. I have some skin in the game. And I was hoping that it could grow into more.
Yeah. You want it to be successful. You have a reason to. Yeah.
And then in my job later on, whether it was at Aetna or later on over at HP, I'd just come across startups that I thought were interesting and I thought that I could help. And if the founder also found whatever I had to offer interesting, that's when we would talk compensation of either equity or something else. So for me, it was kind of organic, but I think nowadays, right, in 2024 and beyond, there are matchmaking services now, right? There's platforms like SoMeDocs. There's platforms, and I'm blanking on it, but there's a couple that are now popping up that are specifically trying to matchmake between clinicians that want to get into the space and companies that want that type of expertise. I think the only thing that I'm seeing that's a little different is that they each have different expectations of the other, and sometimes they're not being met.
I've seen some of those as well and been involved some of those where they, all they want is your time for like half an hour, right? They're not looking for you to be an advisor in perpetuity. They're just looking for advice for a couple of minutes. And I get signed up for those every so often, but they're few and far between. Let's take a step back and talk a little about your experience working in healthcare companies where it wasn't about the healthcare. Cause it's actually, we're kind of running low on time, and it's what I initially thought the bulk of the conversation was going to be about, but just, from working in companies that are not in the business of healthcare for the most part, maybe they have a healthcare arm like GE, like Goldman Sachs, like Hewlett Packard, right? Do you have any takeaways from working in those? Like something that, it opened your eyes to, wow, this is something that happens in either in business or in healthcare.
And again, my experience obviously is very different now 20 years later compared to what you can get now on the internet or what's available on YouTube or any of the social media platforms. Look, I didn't know anything about investment banking when I started. I didn't know anything about consulting when I started it. So for me, it was that eye-opening thing of there's this thing that's way out of my experience that I don't know any other way to get it outside of doing it. Let me do it and find out if it's something that I'd like to do and want to do. I'm always going to be grateful for the skill sets I got from those companies. It was actually while I was at Goldman that I actually met my wife, but it also convinced me that wasn't the lifestyle for me.
Why is
Because
that?
so I was in a field called equity research, which is basically stock picking. They do research reports that are then sold to clients, typically at hedge funds or mutual funds or whatnot. To be really good at that field, you have to be the master of every single aspect of information, and you need to be able to craft an investment idea that people want to invest in. That's a significant amount of time for a lot of these guys. If they don't go over to run a hedge fund, which a lot of them did, you're basically at the office 24/7. Like you're there all the time. So it's like being on call all the time, except the important thing, which is again, a little bit skewed because of our experience, it's not a human life. It could be $100 million. I think that might have been what was part of the problem for me, because with our clinical background, you prioritize things based on, is this good for a patient? Is this going to save someone's life? Is this going to improve their life? Is this going to hurt them? That's not how most businesses are structured.
Am I going to make a rich person richer?
Well, there's a lot of sacrifices to be made about that, but then their prioritization scale is totally different from ours, right?
Yeah.
So I had a friend from business school who had tried to get me into first equity research and later on into hedge funds. He ended up going into hedge funds himself. He was a couple years ahead of me at Duke, also a fellow Michigander. So, really admired him a lot. We fell out of touch. He ended up committing suicide, I want to say now about 7 years ago, because he was being prosecuted for insider trading. Apparently, and again, no idea about the truth of it. It doesn't sound like his character to me, but
Yeah.
I hadn't talked to him in a long time. But I guess the truth of it was, to get the edge in investing in the market, there was talk of him financially influencing officials at the FDA to get
Okay.
insider information ahead of the market so he could either trade or transmit information to others. And he was being interrogated by the district attorney, and married, had at least one kid as far as I knew, had a brownstone in Brooklyn. The next day I read about it and it just broke my heart. And I think he was a year or two younger than me too. It kind of convinced me I made the right choice for me.
Yeah. I mean, the pressure that we're under when we're dealing with patients is, yes, we have the gravity of this human life in front of us, but it's not to take anything away from, I said it flippantly. Now I'm regretting it. With you having told that story about making rich people richer. It's not just that. It's like, this person it might be my livelihood. It might be a bunch of retirees that are depending on this income that this person's trading on, and so it's not just, some billionaire who owns the building in Manhattan that you're living in. It's people's livelihood and their well-being and their ability to pay their bills. So there is that element to it. And, a lot of these industries are pressure cookers in the same way ours is. So yeah, that's awful. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Sorry, I feel like I'm just giving you all these stories, and it's not meant to be that way. It's just, you had asked me before about, we talked about missed opportunities. I talked to my wife about this from time to time. I missed an opportunity to work at the FDA during the Bush administration while I was working at Goldman Sachs. Would have worked under, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I worked under Scott Gottlieb, who ended up running
Yes.
the FDA under Trump. But he was
Yes.
working under Mark McClellan at the time. And he was one of the only presidents that had done finance along with medicine, I think through Mount Sinai. So that was an opportunity I kind of said no to, because my future wife at the time and I were talking. She's like, I don't want to move to DC. I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, I guess that's not going to happen. And later on, there was a presidential innovation fellowship I ended up being able to take because we just couldn't make it work for my family. When I look at what I've got, I've talked to my wife about this a dozen times. The decisions I've made and the things I've turned down have led me down the road where I have a great family. Like, I've got my son who I adore, got my wife who I adore. She's over in the bathroom now listening on this, so I'm sure she's like, oh my God, what's he saying? Those decisions were key decisions that if I had accepted it or gone a different path, I wouldn't have the life I have now. And I'd like the life I have now.
Yeah. It's not just about the career.
Yeah.
It's about the entire ecosystem
Yeah.
that the career is a small part of. Your experiences with your friends really highlights that. You got to be able to enjoy the life you've built for yourself. Right. There might be some regrets. Oh, I could have taken this path or that path, but who knows where you would have ended up. Some of these paths, you wouldn't have met your wife. You wouldn't have met your wife.
That's exactly
So-
right.
Exactly.
And Brad, you know it, for doing your job optimally, you have to be, it's not just the job that needs to be optimal. It's everything in your life that has to be optimal to do what you do. Even this podcast, right?
Yeah.
To have that all optimal. That's not by accident. That's by design.
Yeah. I've gotten most of my negative Google reviews in times when my kids were not, it's not their fault. They're kids, and nights that they were not sleeping well. Because we, with 3 kids, there were nights where none of them slept very well. And so
Yeah.
there were like 11 wake ups between all of them, most of which my wife got, some of which I got. And then I was not in great shape the next day, and maybe not my most patient, and got those 1-star Google reviews. So yes, it all needs to work. It all needs to work for it to work.
That's right.
All right. Well, tell us, what can we look forward to hearing from you on the podcast? Like, what is the area that the audience can expect when they see an interview by Dr. George Mathew?
So I can tell you where I would like to go, and then I can tell you where I probably will go. We've got a lot of hype still in the sector about what technology can do. Everyone's still talking about wanting to be the next Apple, the next Google, the next Uber. And my issue with that has always been, technology is not the savior. It's a tool, right? What people seem to forget, and I'm still working on my write-up on this, is that technology is a way to change your behavior to make other things happen. And, it sounds kind of silly. It's like you have an app that, like Uber, and you press a button and a car comes. But getting people to adopt that app and get used to doing that versus calling a yellow cab, that's the behavior change, right? That's the magic. I think what people have to realize is that healthcare really is people helping other people. And that may not necessarily be clinicians. That may just be other people. We have a physician shortage that's not going to be corrected anytime soon. We have not enough staff, not enough nurses, not enough pay, but people still need help. So the question is, what kind of structures are going to be, what kind of business models are going to be supported in the future? Supported by technology, right? Because if you look at any of the tech companies that are out there now, your Ubers or your Expedias, Uber is probably a better example. It's not really a technology play. It's a way to redesign businesses so that they don't have to take as much cost on, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to pay for a dispatcher now. I don't have to cover the health insurance for my cabs. Basically, they're all independent contractors, and all I have is a slick app. And then I basically make sure I keep a good amount of the margin for myself, but people are using the app and they get organized and they get transported and everyone's quote unquote happy. So there's nothing to say we can't do that in healthcare. I think the only difference is, are businesses willing to share some of that benefit financially or otherwise? I would say the existing businesses would say no. If I'm an insurance company or I'm a hospital or healthcare system, I really don't want to share even a penny with another vendor. Not unless I'm making money off that vendor. I mean, United Healthcare Optum's a great example. I've got a million pies. Every one of them is extracting a penny out of your dollar till there's basically not enough left to give care to people. Or apparently pay for cybersecurity for my claims processing. Was that too low? Was that bad?
No, that was good. We did an episode on that. By the time this comes out, it'll be a couple of weeks ago when we did that episode on Change Healthcare, subsidiary of Optum, subsidiary of United Healthcare. And, and then there's the opportunism of, is the goal of this technology going to be improving people's health, or is it going to be finding ways to increase revenue? Because those two, it's a lot easier to find ways to make money than it is to improve people's health. And there's certainly money to be made from improving health. Certainly, that's what we do. But to try and find ways to extract more from the system, or make people believe they're doing something or accomplishing something that they're not actually accomplishing, doing things from their health that don't improve their health or longevity, but make it feel like they're doing something. There's going to be all of those pretenders out there that are going to be vying for those same dollars.
Yeah, this is something that's starting to come up more and more as people are realizing that a lot of their dollars not being spent on them to get better. I think people are realizing that healthcare as a business is risk transfer. Like when I go to pay somebody for something, I am assuming they're going to reduce my risk of sickness or death. You and I have been in the business long enough to know that that's never something we've been able to guarantee. You can't guarantee 100% of the time, like buying a product off of Amazon or something like that. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But it's that uncertainty that a lot of other intermediary companies have jumped on to say, well, we don't guarantee it either. And we're not a fiduciary and we're not responsible. And I think people are starting to get wise to it because they're realizing that they're being sold a bad bill of goods, snake oil in some cases, and they're not getting any results for it. There's a great healthcare economist, Paul Keckley. I think he's out of Nashville. He started talking about how he believes in the next 10 years, people are going to start underwriting their own healthcare because no one else is paying for it, right?
Yeah.
There's that multi-plan thing that just came out recently where they were talking about how payers have basically worked behind the scenes to make sure that the payer themselves pay less, but they push more of the bill onto the member. That's not going to go down anytime soon.
I remember with one of the parts of the Affordable Care Act was that health insurance companies can only make a certain percent per year in terms of profit, right? And that first year, a bunch of people got checks back. And then some fancy accounting made that never happen again. So, remarkable that we tried to make it so that they really were only incentivized to make a certain amount and the rest would go back to the patients. And
it's definitely shown us how this works, right? The MLR, the medical loss ratio is supposed to be 85%, right? Like, so 15% for administration. The workaround I've been seeing lately has been, well, I'm Optum. I have a claims processing business and a PT business and other business. That doesn't fall into the MLR. So I think somebody just put out how Kaiser covers more people, but Optum makes 20 times the revenue, specifically the margin. And it's because the farther away you get from taking care of a patient, the more profit you can make.
Well, all the more reason for us to get in there, get involved with business to change things to help the patients more. Well, George, it's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I'm sure the audience is looking forward to hearing more from you as well. So thank you so much for what you do for patients and for healthcare, and thank you for your time.
Brad, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to being on here again with some good interviews.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.